Sit down, Congresswoman, before you end up like your brother. The words came from Derek Bull Harlan, his voice echoing through the marble corridor of the Manhattan Federal Courthouse. His tone carried no fear, no respect, only that heavy mix of contempt and pride that once made juries believe him. He leaned on the railing outside courtroom 7B, smirking under the flicker of fluorescent light. His badge glinted faintly, though it no longer held power. When Aaliyah Johnson turned toward him, her eyes didn't blink. For the first time since Jamal's death, she faced the man who took everything from her. Before going into this story, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe and give this story a like. Now, let's begin. Aaliyah stood in the lobby, hands clasped tight around a small leather folder. She wore a dark blue suit, simple, deliberate, chosen to make her invisible. Every click of her heels echoed like a countdown. The courthouse smelled of paper, coffee, and nerves, a blend she knew too well from her days in Congress. But this wasn't Washington. This was the arena where her brother's ghost still spoke in whispers. 4 years ago, Jamal Johnson had been dragged through the gray corridors of Rikers Island. A 20-year-old kid, honors student, arrested for recording Bull taking a bribe behind a Bronx deli. The video vanished that night. Hours later, Jamal was found hanging from a bedsheet. The police called it suicide. The city called it procedure. Aaliyah called it murder. She had spent the years since wearing masks, congresswoman, reformer, survivor. But beneath the surface, she carried a fire that would not die. At dawn, while others drafted bills, she wrapped her hands in tape and punched a heavy bag in a Brooklyn dojo. Her trainer, Master Kai Chen, once told her, "You don't fight to destroy, you fight to breathe." She lived by those words now. When Bull entered the courtroom, the air changed, even disbarred and disgraced. He carried himself like a man who still believed he owned the world. 6'4", 250 pounds of arrogance and old power. The room fell silent when he took his seat at the defense table. He didn't look at the judge. He looked straight at Aaliyah. "Still chasing ghosts?" he muttered under his breath as he passed her. "Street rats like your brother never learn their place." Aaliyah didn't respond. She pressed her thumb into the corner of her folder to keep from shaking. Inside it was a single page, the autopsy photo of Jamal's bruised neck. She had promised herself she would look at it only once more, to remember, to end it. Judge Elena Ramirez called the hearing to order. The case was simple on paper, a corruption review tied to Bull's protection racket. But everyone in that room knew it was more. It was the shadow of a city's conscience laid bare. The press lined the back row. Cameras rolled. The nation watched. Bull's lawyer began with practiced ease. "My client, a decorated officer with 22 years of service, denies all allegations. This is a political circus led by an ambitious congresswoman exploiting her brother's death for headlines." Aaliyah closed her eyes briefly. She could feel her heart thudding against the ribs that once held her brother when they were children hiding from their father's rage. She had sworn then she'd protect Jamal. Now, that promise echoed like a wound. The judge asked Aaliyah to present her statement. She rose slowly, her voice steady but low. "Your Honor, this isn't about politics. It's about a boy who believed in truth and paid for it with his life, and about a man who traded his badge for blood money." Bull laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Truth? That's rich coming from a woman who can't even prove her own brother didn't hang himself." The courtroom stirred. Reporters leaned forward. Aaliyah looked straight at him. "You were there, weren't you?" she asked softly. "You made sure of it." Bull smiled. "Careful, Congresswoman. You're under oath." Her hand trembled slightly as she opened the folder and placed the photo on the table. "So were you," she said, for a moment. Silence blanketed the room. Then Bull stepped forward, towering over her. He crushed the photo under his boot, grinding it into the floor. "Your brother wasn't a hero," he hissed. "He was a mistake." Something inside Aaliyah went cold. The room blurred. She remembered Jamal's laugh, his promise to study law, his dreams of joining her in Washington, and then the image of that same face, silent, blue, lifeless. Judge Ramirez banged the gavel. "Lieutenant Harlan, you will control yourself." Bull didn't move. He stared at Aaliyah as if daring her to speak. She met his gaze. "You can step on his picture," she said evenly, "but you can't erase what he left behind." He leaned close, his breath sour with arrogance. "You keep pushing me. You'll end up just like him." The gavel struck again. Order restored. But Aaliyah heard every word as clearly as if it were carved in stone. The threat wasn't empty. It was a promise. That night, she returned to her mother's old apartment in Brooklyn. The lights flickered, just as they did years ago when Jamal used to sneak in after curfew. She sat on the couch, surrounded by boxes of his things, college notebooks, worn sneakers, and a faded brown teddy bear missing one button eye. It was the only thing she hadn't been able to throw away. She held it for a long time, pressing it against her chest. Something inside it shifted, an unfamiliar weight. She turned it over, saw a small tear near the seam, and pulled at it gently. A flash drive slid into her palm, wrapped in tape and dust. Her breath caught. When she connected it to her laptop, the screen flickered. Then, grainy footage appeared, Jamal's voice, trembling but clear. "Officer Harlan, you can't keep taking their money. People are dying." The camera angle shifted. Bull's face filled the frame, angry, caught off guard. He shoved Jamal against a wall, money in his fist. "You think anyone's gonna believe you? Boy, you're nothing without me." The video ended abruptly with static. Aaliyah sat motionless, the room silent except for her heartbeat. The evidence Jamal died for was here, hidden in the one place no one would ever look. She exhaled slowly, tears falling onto the keyboard. At dawn, she stood by the window as the city stirred awake. In a few hours, she would walk back into that courthouse, this time, not as a grieving sister, but as a weapon carved from truth. Down on the street, a police car idled, through the open window. She heard that same cruel voice through a loudspeaker. Bull's men, mocking even now. "Morning, Congresswoman, careful crossing the street. Wouldn't want you ending up like your brother." Her hands clenched, but her voice stayed calm. "You first," she whispered. The sun rose over Brooklyn, pale and unsteady, as if unsure it wanted to witness what came next. At 4 a.m, Aaliyah's fists struck the heavy bag in a steady rhythm. Thud, breath, thud. The Brooklyn dojo was dark except for a single light above her head. Sweat slid down her arms, landing on the mat like tiny raindrops. Every punch carried a name, every exhale a memory. Jamal, Justice, Bull. She imagined his face taped to the bag, that same smirk he wore when he crushed her brother's picture in court. She didn't fight to win anymore. She fought to stay alive long enough to finish what Jamal began. The city outside was asleep, but Aaliyah's mind never rested. Sleep brought memories she couldn't bear. The sound of her mother's cries, the silence of the phone call that night, the way her father had stared at the news without a word. She'd trained for 4 years under Master Kai Chen, who once told her, "Pain doesn't leave you. You learn to live beside it." That morning, as the sun crept through the cracked window, she whispered his words back to herself. Live beside it, not beneath it. Later that day, in her small congressional office downtown, she stared at Jamal's USB still sealed in a plastic bag. FBI agent Lena Park had confirmed the footage's authenticity. Bull had taken a bribe, $120,000, from a cartel affiliate named Marco Ruiz. That payment alone linked Bull to 3 unsolved murders, yet without more. The case wouldn't hold. Park's team needed a witness. That was when Aaliyah's phone buzzed with a message that changed everything. It was from an unknown number, Ryan Harlan. The name stopped her cold. She had seen him once, years ago. A quiet teenager always sitting behind the bleachers when Jamal played basketball. He was Bull's son. The message read, "My father killed Jamal. I can prove it. Meet me tonight." Aaliyah hesitated. It could be a trap. But something in her heart told her Ryan wasn't lying. He had been Jamal's friend once, before his father dragged him into that dark empire. She sent a short reply. "Where?" The response came quick. Pier 19. Midnight. She didn't tell the FBI. Not yet. She needed to hear it for herself. When the night came, the Hudson air was cold and sharp. She wore a simple coat and kept her hair tied back. The pier was nearly empty except for a flickering street lamp and the hum of the river below. Then she saw him. Thin, pale, shaking. A shadow of the boy she remembered. "Ryan," she said softly. He turned, startled, eyes red from exhaustion. "You came. Why contact me now?" He rubbed his hands together, trembling. "Because he's losing control. The cartel's cutting him off. He's scared you'll expose him." "What do you have?" she asked. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small notebook wrapped in tape. Dates. Payments. He made me drive the money. I didn't know what I was doing until I saw Jamal's face on the news. I wanted to tell someone. But, before he could finish, headlights swept across the pier. Aaliyah spun around. A black SUV rolled to a stop 30 feet away. 2 men stepped out, both large, both wearing black gloves. "Run!" she shouted. Ryan froze. The first man lunged forward, grabbing Aaliyah's arm. Instinct took over. She pivoted, twisting his wrist and driving her elbow into his chest. The second man swung a knife. She ducked, grabbed his arm, and pulled him off balance. The blade clattered to the ground. She kicked it away, trapping him in a jiu-jitsu armbar until she heard the joint strain. "Who sent you?" she demanded. He groaned, choking on his breath. "Bull," said, "make it look like an accident." Ryan picked up the knife with shaking hands. "He'll kill us both." "No," Aaliyah said firmly. "Not this time." Sirens echoed in the distance. The men scrambled to their feet, limping toward the SUV before speeding off. Ryan's notebook lay torn on the ground. She grabbed it, tucked it into her coat, and pulled him toward her car. At dawn. Agent Park stood in her doorway holding a file. "You didn't tell me about the meeting," she said quietly. Aaliyah sighed. "I didn't know if I could trust anyone." "You can trust me," Park replied. "We've analyzed your brother's video. The audio alone is enough to reopen the case, but the notebook, you just gave us the nail in the coffin." Aaliyah handed it over. "Then finish it." That afternoon, FBI Director Harper announced a full federal probe into NYPD corruption linked to Bull Harlan. The news spread like wildfire. Talk shows dissected every word. Some called Aaliyah reckless. Others called her brave. She ignored both. All she wanted was truth. By nightfall, the retaliation came as she left her office garage. A figure stepped from behind a pillar. Before she could react, a heavy fist struck her ribs, sending her to the ground. The man loomed above her, one of Bull's enforcers from the pier, face hidden under a black hood. Message from Bull. He growled. She rolled aside just as his boot slammed where her head had been. Pain shot through her side, but training took over. She swept her leg, knocking him down, grabbed his wrist, and twisted until she heard the snap. He screamed, his knife clattering across the floor. "Tell him!" She gasped, pressing her knee against his chest. "This isn't fear, it's justice catching up." The man spat blood, muttering curses. She pressed harder until he dropped his phone. The screen lit up with Bull's name. She held it to her ear. His voice was low, calm, dangerous. "You just made a mistake." "Congresswoman," she answered. "You made one 4 years ago." Then she hung up. Minutes later, the FBI arrived. Agent Park crouched beside the unconscious assailant, lifting a small badge clipped inside his jacket. A retired NYPD detective, once on Bull's payroll. "This is bigger than we thought," Park said grimly. "You just cracked the door open on something massive." Aaliyah winced as medics checked her ribs. Then kick it open. By morning, the confession came. The man, faced with 20 years in federal prison, told the agents everything: names, payments, even where the cartel laundered money through city contracts. Bull's empire was unraveling. When Park called later that evening, her tone carried a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "We got the warrant. Rikers. 2021, all footage reopened. Harlan's done." Aaliyah stood by the window, the city lights blinking like silent witnesses. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to exhale, but deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Bull was cornered, and men like him didn't go quietly. In her mirror, the bruises on her ribs darkened. She touched them lightly, almost with respect. Every scar now had purpose. Every wound was a reminder that justice wasn't just an idea, it was a fight. As the night settled, her phone buzzed again. A video message. No name, no number. She opened it. It was Bull, filmed in his car, smirking into the camera. "You think you've won. Congresswoman," he said, "I built this city's fear with my hands. You can't take that away. You come after me again, and I'll make you wish you stayed in Washington." The video ended, but his words hung in the air like smoke. Aaliyah stared at her reflection. Her eyes didn't flinch. "Then I'll burn your empire to the ground," she whispered. Outside, the sirens of New York rolled on, steady, restless, and alive. As another night began its march toward reckoning, the hearing that morning filled the courtroom to a hush so complete it felt like a held breath. Cameras framed every face. The judge's gavel sat heavy and patient, and the world leaned forward as if the next sound might decide the shape of things to come. Aaliyah rose to cross-examine with a calm she had trained into her bones. Each word measured, each question a quiet tool aimed at the rotten hinge of Derek Harlan's life. She did not shout, did not posture. She spoke like a prosecutor and a sister at once, and the courtroom listened because the two could not be disentangled. On the screen above the bench, the prosecution queue transferred a small, grainy file, Jamal's hidden footage, into the main feed. The jumbotron flickered and then widened until the jury, the gallery, and the reporters watched a young man, frightened but steady, record with a trembling hand, and then watched Derek Harlan's face, older and angrier, take shape in a doorway where the money passed under the light. The room tasted of copper and paper as the audio swelled and Jamal's voice whispered what he dared to say: "You cannot keep taking their money." The silence after that voice was a living thing. Even the judge's throat moved, but no sound came. Bull's lawyer tried to interrupt, called it edited, politically motivated, but the image on the screen held: money, a hand, the officer's jaw set like a trap, and the prosecutor asked one simple, surgical question: "Did you receive this payment, Lieutenant Harlan?" For a heartbeat, the man in the dock was all bluster and old medals. Then his eyes narrowed, and something like a storm rolled across his face. He stood. The motion was sudden, a bull unconcerned with consequences, and the courtroom flinched as if expecting thunder. He walked toward Aaliyah with that slow certainty of someone who had always been allowed to cross lines and found them clear. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Instead, he slapped her, Slapped. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the oak-paneled room. It was a gesture meant to humiliate, to remind her of a place the system had assigned to people like Jamal and like her when grief made them loud. But Aaliyah had trained in the dark for moments like that. She had rehearsed shock and response until movement was second nature, and the slap connected with air. She moved with a silence that felt like a promise. Her body dipped. Her right knee came up, and she met his ribs with the force of everything she had held inside for 4 years. Then, without theatrics, she followed with an elbow driven down across his shoulder, a harsh, precise motion that cracked the old armor and brought him to his knees. The room erupted. Cameras spun, shouts broke loose, phones raised like talismans. While the judge's voice tried to reassert order but could not quite catch the way the world had tilted, television networks froze the frame. The feed went viral within minutes. Millions watched the moment she dodged humiliation and converted it into defense. Within 24 hours, the clip had been shared worldwide 350 million times, debated in op-eds, imprinted on late-night monologues, and dissected on pundit panels. People who had never heard Jamal's name before now felt the crack of that courthouse sound inside their own chests. Some called Aaliyah reckless, others called her a hero. Many simply watched and felt the strange. Private satisfaction of seeing a wrong acknowledged in the only language some people seemed to understand. Immediate consequence. Meanwhile, in the small, sharp world of the courthouse, Bull lay on a stretcher with a broken rib and a face made smaller by surprise. Officers cuffed him for contempt and assault. The irony that a man who had long used the badge to act above the law was now being led away in chains was not lost on anyone present. The legal theater resumed in the days that followed with a speed that made Aaliyah dizzy. Emergency hearings, a new indictment on charges of assault stemming from Jamal's death, and the federal investigators closing ranks around the corruption the USB had exposed. Agent Lena Park moved like a tide, pushing warrants and subpoenas across New York like a clean wind, trying to sweep rot into open air. City officials who had turned their faces away were suddenly asked to describe their meetings in public. The police union cried foul and pointed to the slap as proof of a political ambush. Conservative commentators used the clip to argue for law and order. Progressive media used the same clip to show that power could be challenged and might break. Aaliyah watched it all with the steady gaze of someone who had both planned a battle and felt its cost. She wrote no op-eds. She answered few interviews. She let the law do the work she had set in motion and let the world decide what it would be. At the heart of the frenzy, two distinct truths circulated. One, that the footage from Jamal's USB tied Bull to bribe payments and to people who had disappeared. Two, that Bull, humiliated and hurt, had grown dangerous in that place where power and resentment meet. He pledged retaliation in the press, thin threats veiled by lawyers, and quietly, from within a hospital bed and then a cell, began to assemble new instruments of violence. Men who had once shoved envelopes into his hands were still on call. Hired muscle could be summoned as easily as a car in the city. In the shadowed rooms where such things are discussed, Bull's people whispered about making it look like an accident. The FBI, now alert to those plans, began to guard witnesses and reroute couriers. Aaliyah's security detail tripled overnight. She accepted the presence of agents with a gratitude that was both private and public. But the public scene kept moving. The video had cracked open public sympathy in places Aaliyah had not expected. A retired detective in Ohio sent a tip about a money trail. A former council aide in Queens provided a payroll ledger. A clerk in a Bronx procurement office handed over receipts that matched cash withdrawals on dates Bull should have been on duty. The federal net tightened, and the list of people implicated lengthened until it threatened to topple small towers of influence across precincts and municipal offices within 72 hours. The department announced an arrest for Lieutenant Derek Harlan on charges related to Jamal's death and a raft of corruption counts. He was booked, photographed, and processed. The same badge that had once opened doors now lay inside an evidence bag. Yet even as he was booked, men approached his defense with new offers. Bull's pride would not let him go down with nothing, and the old networks that had enabled him for years moved to secure his fortunes. Hired hands, private investigators, men who knew how to make trouble vanish. He sent calls from his cell, cursing and plotting. Offers were whispered to those who owed him favors. The machinery of retaliation engaged quietly, the way storms gather in places you cannot always see. Aaliyah, who had just become the focus of both veneration and vilification, understood that criminal charges meant little if the men who protected Bull could still act in the night. She tightened her protection, trusted her friends, and promised herself that if the law could not keep people safe, she would find a way to make it do so. By the time the immediate uproar cooled to a roar that could be measured in columns and cable segments, the city had learned two things: that a congresswoman could be struck and answer in kind, and that one boy's video could undo reputations built on silence for Aaliyah. The moment was both victory and threshold. Jamal's name echoed in her ears, not as an accusation, but as a summons. She had not sought the strike. She had only sought the truth. The strike changed the tone of the battle. It showed that the costs of silence were rising. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered and dispersed, their chants rearranging the air like a new architecture of demand. Inside, Aaliyah sat for a moment alone in a small anteroom and allowed her hands to shake. She closed her eyes and felt Jamal's presence like a hand on her shoulder. Not the weight of guilt, but the weight of purpose. The trial that would follow was no longer simply about corruption. It had become the hinge upon which a city would choose whether to keep tolerating shadows, or finally, to step into the light. By dawn, the headlines had already shifted from awe to suspicion. The same media that celebrated Aaliyah's courage now questioned her motives, and the same networks that aired the footage of Bull's assault on repeat now debated whether she had enticed him into it. The police union held a press conference under a marble arch downtown, declaring her a manipulator who had entrapped a good officer. Their spokesman called her a lawmaker turned lawbreaker. Aaliyah watched the broadcast in silence from her office, her coffee untouched, her ribs still aching from the fight that made her famous. The words slid off her like rain on glass, but she could feel their intent, to twist the narrative until she became the villain of her own crusade. That afternoon, a letter arrived on Capitol Hill. It was signed by Representative Victor Kane, her colleague and supposed ally, recommending a federal ethics investigation against her. Aaliyah's hands tightened around the envelope as she read it. Kane had once promised to support the Jamal Johnson Police Reform Act, but now his name appeared beside men who had quietly taken money from the police union's PAC fund. She wasn't surprised. Corruption never dies. It just learns new languages. In the same hour, Bull's legal team filed an emergency motion claiming he'd been provoked, that Aaliyah's presence and her aggressive questioning had been designed to break him. It was a cruel inversion of truth, a trap she saw coming but couldn't yet stop. Her mentor, Judge Miguel Torres, called that evening. His voice was calm but weary. "They'll try to turn the act of defense into an act of guilt," he said. "That's how systems preserve themselves. I can't back down." Aaliyah replied. "I'm not asking you to," Torres said quietly. "Just remember that the empire you're fighting is old. It feeds on patience and fear." The next morning, she attended a committee hearing on her own bill, the one named after Jamal. Cameras filled the room again, but this time the air was colder. Representative Kane sat 3 seats away, avoiding her eyes. When he finally spoke, he couched betrayal in politeness. Congresswoman Johnson's conduct has raised questions about impartiality, he said smoothly. Until these allegations are resolved, I propose we table the Jamal Act. The gavel fell. And just like that, the bill her brother had inspired was stalled. Aaliyah kept her expression still, but inside, she felt the slow burn of betrayal. She knew the price of challenging power, but she hadn't expected the knife to come from her own side. After the hearing, she found Kane in the corridor, speaking to reporters. She waited until they dispersed before she stepped forward. $80,000, she said quietly. He blinked. Excuse me? That's what the police union paid you to stall my bill. I have the transfers. Do you sleep better knowing your name cost that much? Kane's smile faltered, then returned with practiced ease. You're out of your depth. Aaliyah, go back to your speeches. This is real politics. She turned away before she said something she couldn't take back. As she walked down the marble hall, her phone vibrated. A call from Agent Lena Park. The voice on the other end was tight, urgent. We have movement. Harlan's reaching out to contractors. What kind of contractors? The kind that don't file taxes. One's already in the city. Stay alert. That night, Aaliyah refused to hide. She still attended a quiet fundraiser for victims' families at a Brooklyn church, shaking hands, hugging mothers who had lost sons, smiling when she had no reason to smile. Outside, the streetlights hummed in the humid air. As the event ended, she stepped into the parking lot. Her car waited at the far end. Under a flickering bulb, she didn't notice the black sedan parked 2 spaces away until the window rolled down. A glint, a whisper, then the crack of a rifle. The first shot shattered the side mirror. She dove behind a concrete pillar, heart pounding. Another round struck the hood, sending sparks into the night. Her bodyguards shouted, returning fire. But Aaliyah's instincts moved faster than thought. She crawled to the trunk of her car, popped it open, and pulled out the one thing she had built in secret, a compact ballistic shield made from reinforced polymer, the same design her team had once proposed for field agents. She crouched low, angled it toward the shooter's light. The next shot hit the plate dead center. The impact jolted her arm but didn't break through. By the time the shooter reloaded, Park's tactical team arrived, lights flashing, sirens cutting through the darkness. The sedan sped away, tires screaming. Aaliyah rose slowly, trembling but alive. When the agents reached her, she said only one word: enough. The next morning, the story flooded every channel. Second attempt on Congresswoman Johnson's life. Pundits debated whether she was a martyr or a menace. Social media split into camps, half demanding protection, half calling it a hoax. But in the chaos, another story broke. Ryan Harlan, Bull's estranged son, was found dead in a midtown motel. Overdose. The news hit Aaliyah like a blow to the chest. She sat on her couch staring at the headline. Ryan had been her one fragile bridge to the truth, the only living soul who could have testified about his father's crimes. Park arrived an hour later, holding an evidence bag. Inside it was a folded note stained with tears and ink. My father is a monster. Sorry. Jamal. Sorry. Aaliyah. She didn't cry right away. She read it twice, then again, each time hearing Jamal's laughter echo through her memory. 2 boys who should have been brothers in friendship, not in death. Where was the note found? She asked finally. On the desk beside him. Park said, the coroner says it's clean. No sign of foul play. But the timing isn't coincidence. Aaliyah finished. Bull's breaking. Park nodded. We're closing in, but you need to lay low. He's desperate, and desperate men don't think, they just react. I'm done hiding, Aaliyah said. If he wants to finish this, I'll be waiting in the light. That night, the FBI raided 3 precincts across New York. Dozens of officers were taken in, some crying, some silent. all aware the shield of brotherhood no longer protected them. Among those arrested was a captain who had been leaking Aaliyah's schedule to Bull, a mole inside the department. His confession tied Bull directly to the attempted hit at the church and to a decade of hidden payoffs. The headlines shifted once more. NYPD mole confesses, federal probe expands, for the first time. Aaliyah allowed herself a single breath of relief. The empire was cracking. Bull's influence, once untouchable, was collapsing under its own weight. But victory came with no joy. 2 young men were gone, one murdered, one lost to guilt. The reform bill lay stalled in Congress. The cost of progress, it seemed, was always counted in lives. She walked to the window of her apartment, city lights stretching out like a living map of struggle and survival. Somewhere out there, Bull sat alone, his son buried, his empire bleeding. She could almost feel his rage reaching across the distance, that hunger to reclaim control. "Let it burn," she whispered, behind her. The television played a clip from an old interview of Jamal's college days. He was smiling shyly, saying he wanted to change how police saw young black men. His dream had been small then, but pure. Aaliyah turned off the TV, letting silence fill the room. She didn't need the screen to remember his face. She saw it every time she closed her eyes. Outside, a cold rain began to fall, the kind that washed the grime off the streets but left the stains beneath untouched. And somewhere in a federal cell, Derek Harlan looked out through narrow bars, feeling the walls close in, realizing that, for the first time in his life, he couldn't scare the dark away. The trial opened under gray morning light, the kind that flattened color and made even marble seem tired. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., was packed beyond capacity. Reporters filled the benches, sketch artists sharpened pencils, and cameras hummed outside the doors like restless bees. This wasn't just another case. This was the reckoning of Derek Bull Harlan, the man who once ruled New York's streets with a badge, a gun, and a smirk. And across from him sat Aaliyah Johnson, the sister of the man he killed, the congresswoman who had turned grief into armor. She didn't look like vengeance. She looked like resolve dressed in navy blue. When Judge Elena Ramirez entered, her eyes met Aaliyah's for a fleeting moment, a quiet acknowledgement between 2 women who had lost brothers to the same disease of power. The judge's voice carried through the chamber, even and steady. The United States versus Derek Harlan. Charges: conspiracy, racketeering, corruption, murder, and obstruction of justice. Bull sat with his wrists chained to the table, wearing the crisp suit of a man who still believed presentation could save him. His hair was slicked back, but the face beneath it was pale, thinner now, stripped of the swagger that once filled entire rooms. Still, when the cameras turned toward him, he lifted his chin, and for a second, you could almost see the old arrogance return. The prosecution began with the evidence: money transfers, audio files, body cam gaps, the footage Jamal had recorded, the bank records Ryan had left behind. The pieces fit together like glass shards forming a mirror. Each reflected Bull's crimes from a new angle. One for greed, one for cruelty, one for the kind of pride that rots the soul. Then came the witness list. FBI agent Lena Park was first. She approached the stand with her usual composure, a folder in hand. Her testimony was clinical, methodical, and devastating. She spoke of coded payments disguised as overtime bonuses, of falsified reports, and of an internal NYPD chat log where Bull ordered cleanup jobs when asked to clarify. She looked directly at him. Cleanup meant kill orders. He used the same term every time. Bull smirked. "You can't prove any of that." Park didn't flinch. "We can, because Jamal Johnson recorded you saying it." The courtroom stiffened. Judge Ramirez signaled to the bailiff. On the large screen, Jamal's final audio played. His voice was quiet but brave. "Officer Harlan, you can't keep killing people to protect your deals." Then Bull's recorded reply, "Kid, if you talk, you'll end up in a cell with your own belt around your neck." The sound cut off, leaving a vacuum where air used to be. Aaliyah's hands clenched in her lap. Even the jurors looked shaken. For years she had imagined that conversation. But hearing her brother's fear and Bull's indifference, felt like being branded. Bull's lawyer rose immediately, objecting to selective evidence, but his client interrupted him with a growl. "Play the rest," Bull said. "Let them hear how scared he was." The judge frowned. "You will not. I said play it," he shouted. The bailiff hesitated, then pressed the key again. Static. Then Jamal's voice one last time. "If I die, my sister will know. She always knows." A single tear rolled down Aaliyah's cheek. Bull stared at the floor, when it was her turn to take the stand. Aaliyah rose slowly, smoothing her jacket. She looked neither angry nor afraid. "My brother believed in justice," she said. "He believed that truth would protect him. I used to believe that too. But truth doesn't protect. It exposes, and that's what we're doing here today." Bull snorted. "Spare us the sermon." Judge Ramirez shot him a warning glare. "Lieutenant Harlan, one more outburst and you'll be removed." He laughed. "Removed? From what? The truth? You all wanted this. A show. A headline." He leaned forward, voice rising. "You think you're saints because you caught me, but you're all the same. You just hide behind better suits." The courtroom murmured. Aaliyah remained silent. She could feel his rage circling, desperate to provoke her. The prosecutor stepped forward. "Mr. Harlan, is it true you authorized 9 hits over the span of 7 years?" Bull's lips curled. "You think I remember names? Half of those people were street trash, gang dealers, traitors, rats. The city's cleaner because of me. Did Jamal Johnson deserve to die?" For a moment, something cracked in Bull's face. His jaw tightened, eyes darting toward the jury. He got in the way. Say it clearly." The prosecutor pressed. Bull slammed his fist on the table. "I killed the kid to save my son. You hear me? I killed him because Ryan couldn't take the heat. He was weak. He used. He stole. Everything I did was for that ungrateful boy. And now he's dead too." The words echoed through the chamber like an explosion. A gasp rolled across the room. The defense attorney buried his face in his hands. Bull was still shouting. "You all wanted a confession? There it is. You think I don't know what I've done? I built this city's safety while you slept. And what do I get? Chains?" The judge's gavel thundered. "Order! Order!" But Bull wasn't finished. He turned toward Aaliyah, veins rising in his neck. "You think you're justice? You're just revenge in a suit." She stood slowly. Her voice was steady, almost calm. "No, Derek. I'm what comes after." That simple sentence broke him. He lunged across the table, a movement born of instinct and humiliation. 2 guards stepped forward, tackling him before he reached her. One drew his weapon, the report of a warning shot cracking into the ceiling. The courtroom fell still, smoke curling upward like the last breath of violence itself. Bull was dragged back to his seat, panting, his wrists bleeding against the cuffs. The judge stared down at him with the quiet fury of someone who had seen too much. "This court finds Derek Harlan guilty on all counts. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. You will be transferred immediately to ADX Florence." A hush settled over the room. Aaliyah felt her knees weaken but refused to sit. Bull slumped, his eyes dull, the fight gone out of him. For the first time since Jamal's death, she saw not the monster, but the hollow man underneath. A man eaten alive by his own lies. When the guards led him out, he turned once, eyes meeting hers. "You win, Congresswoman," he muttered. but the ghosts stay with you. She watched him go without a word. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was enormous. Some shouted her name, others simply stared, unsure if they'd just witnessed justice or another kind of tragedy. The air buzzed with the sound of helicopters and the static hum of live broadcasts. Reporters swarmed, microphones flashing. "What do you want to say to the people watching?" one called out. Aaliyah paused on the courthouse steps. The wind carried her hair across her face. "I want them to remember that justice isn't born in comfort," she said softly. "It's forged in pain. My brother's gone, but the truth isn't." She walked down the steps without looking back. The cheers rose, then faded into the sound of sirens heading west toward the penitentiary, carrying Derek Harlan toward a cage he could not escape. As the city lights came on that evening, the footage played again on every channel. The moment a powerful man confessed his sins, and a sister finally saw the weight of his empire crumble. For the first time in years, Aaliyah slept without nightmares. She dreamed not of Jamal's death, but of his laughter, bright, unbroken, and free. ADX Florence was known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, a place where the light itself seemed to arrive in chains. Every wall was steel-reinforced concrete, every corridor a tomb for sound. Derek Bull Harlan had once commanded entire precincts with a phone call, but now he counted minutes by the scrape of his food tray and the slow hum of the ventilation system. The guards called him number 7149. To them, he was another fallen king waiting for his sentence to become memory. For months he tried to hold on to the swagger that once made him untouchable, pacing the narrow cell, whispering plans to no one. But silence eats men like him alive. There were no bribes here, no terrified rookies to bark orders at, no cameras to smirk into, only the hum, the isolation, and the ghost of his son. He wrote letters at first, angry, rambling declarations of innocence, half threats and half apologies. None of them were mailed. The warden stacked them in a file marked delusional correspondence. He spent his mornings replaying the trial in his mind, convincing himself the world had betrayed him. Yet, as the weeks dragged into months, the memories grew sharper. He saw Ryan's face when the boy was young, laughing in a baseball uniform, then the same boy, pale and shaking, begging him to stop. Bull had told himself he was saving his son from ruin, but now that lie no longer worked. Ryan's death echoed in his head louder than the cell door ever could. Guilt is a cruel warden. It never leaves the room. The end came quietly. Like most reckonings do, one afternoon, a fight broke out in the exercise yard, small at first. 2 inmates arguing over stolen rations. Bull tried to intervene, still clinging to the instinct of command. "Break it up," he barked, forgetting where he was. The next thing he felt was a shiv sliding between his ribs. He went down hard, face scraping the gravel. The guards blew whistles, but by the time they reached him, he could no longer move his legs. The blade had severed his spinal cord, paralyzed from the waist down. Bull was carried out on a stretcher, staring at the thin slice of sky overhead. The man who once used violence as language had been stripped of it forever. Infirmary life was slower, crueler. Each day began with a nurse lifting him from bed. Each night ended with the sound of restraints clicking shut. No one visited. The press had moved on. The department had erased his name from their rolls, and the city he once controlled now spoke of him only as a cautionary tale. In his final months, the anger drained away, replaced by something heavier than rage, remorse. He began writing again, this time to Aaliyah Johnson. The letters were no longer threats. They were confessions, 12 pages in total, written in shaky pen strokes. He detailed every bribe, every false report, every life ruined. He described Jamal's last moments, the fear in the boy's eyes, the sound of the stun gun, The lie he told afterward. He ended with 5 words. I wish it had been me. The letter reached Aaliyah through the bureau when Agent Park handed it to her. She didn't open it right away. She took it home, sat by the window as the city lights flickered on, and read every line. By the time she finished, her face was wet with quiet tears. She wasn't crying for Bull. She was crying for the years she'd spent chasing ghosts when all she'd wanted was peace. She folded the letter neatly and placed it beside Jamal's photo. It's over, she whispered. 2 weeks later. News broke that Derek Harlan had taken his life. The official report said he used his own shoelaces. The guards found him just before sunrise, slumped forward in his wheelchair, face tilted toward the window as if trying to see something beyond the walls. The story made headlines for a day, then vanished. But for those who had followed the trial, it felt like the last chapter of a long, bitter book finally closing. For Aaliyah, closure didn't come from his death. It came from what followed. The Jamal Johnson Police Reform Act, her brother's bill, passed the Senate with overwhelming support only 3 months after Bull's suicide. The law banned chokeholds, restricted solitary confinement, required independent prosecutors for police-involved deaths, and mandated transparent review boards in all participating states. Within the first 18 months, 37 custody deaths were prevented, and 62 officers were prosecuted for misconduct in 15 states. The ripple effect spread beyond America. 12 countries adopted versions of the same bill under different names, but always with one shared message. Accountability was no longer optional. Aaliyah stood at Jamal's grave that spring, wearing a simple black coat, the wind stirring the edge of her scarf. She placed a single white rose on the headstone and traced his name with her thumb. You saved thousands. Little brother, she said softly. You did what I couldn't. Behind her, Maya and Liam, her adopted children, waited quietly, holding hands. They were the children of another family broken by police violence, but in them, she saw the promise of what her brother's legacy had built. Not vengeance, but renewal. Life, at last, began to move forward. Aaliyah married Daniel Brooks, a civil rights activist who had stood by her during the darkest nights. Together, they expanded the foundation in Jamal's name, funding legal aid for families who couldn't afford justice and training young women in self-defense through community centers across the country. The nation saw her as a symbol of resilience. She saw herself as a survivor, finally learning how to live again. That summer, she returned to the dojo where her journey had begun. The heavy bag still hung in the same corner. She wrapped her hands, breathed deeply, and struck once. Just once. The sound echoed through the empty room, strong and clean, for the first time. It didn't sound like anger. It sounded like peace in the quiet that followed. She looked up, imagining Jamal watching her, smiling with that same shy confidence he once had before the world turned cruel. We made it, she whispered. The fire didn't die. It just found a better way to burn. A year had passed since Derek Harlan's death, and the world around Aaliyah no longer looked the same. The storm that had consumed her life for years had finally begun to clear, leaving behind something quieter, stronger, and enduring. The Jamal Johnson Police Reform Act had taken hold across the country, transforming what had once seemed impossible into ordinary practice. No longer could misconduct hide behind badges or bureaucracy. Departments opened their records. Body cam data became public evidence. Independent prosecutors investigated every in-custody death. Justice had found structure, not just sentiment, but for Aaliyah. The numbers meant little compared to the faces. She met mothers who hugged her as if she were their own daughter. Fathers who thanked her for laws that saved sons they feared would never come home. Schools taught Jamal's name alongside Martin and Rosa. His story became a lesson about courage, conscience, and consequence. The country no longer whispered about him as a victim. It spoke of him as a teacher who had awakened an entire generation. And Aaliyah, though humbled by the reverence, never let herself forget that every victory had been born of loss. Her foundation, defend your truth, had grown far beyond her reach. What began as a few volunteers in a borrowed church basement now spanned dozens of cities and reached across oceans. 50,000 members strong, teachers, nurses, activists, veterans, working together to give power to those who had none. They offered free legal aid to victims of police abuse, martial arts training for women of color, scholarships for students studying criminal justice reform. It became more than a movement. It became a mirror for what humanity could look like when fear was replaced by resolve. Whenever she spoke publicly, people still asked about that moment in the courtroom. The slap, the counterstrike, the spark that lit the fire. She always smiled softly and said, "That wasn't justice. That was survival." Justice came later, when truth had time to breathe. The line spread far beyond her intentions. It appeared on murals, on protest banners, and even on the walls of community centers named after her brother. But Aaliyah never grew comfortable with fame. She saw it as a duty, not a crown. Her life had been shaped by pain, and she refused to let it become spectacle. One afternoon, she received an invitation from the United Nations. They wanted her to speak before the Global Assembly on Human Rights and Accountability. The letter arrived printed on white linen paper, elegant and impersonal. Yet it made her pause for a long time. She had once sat alone in a Brooklyn dojo, learning how to fight. Now she would stand before the world, teaching how to heal when the day came. She walked to the podium with quiet grace. Cameras flashed, and the air in the vast chamber settled into silence. She began not with statistics or applause lines, but with a memory. "My brother Jamal was 20 years old," she said, her voice calm but resonant. "He believed truth would protect him. It didn't. But it taught me something greater. That truth without courage is just a whisper, and courage without justice is just chaos. When they meet, that's when change begins." Her words carried through the hall like steady music. Delegates listened, not as politicians, but as people reminded of their own losses. She ended simply, "Justice isn't revenge, it's change, and change begins the moment one person refuses to stay silent." The crowd rose to its feet. It wasn't the roar of celebration, but the sound of conviction. The kind that lingers long after speeches end. Later that evening, as the city lights shimmered against the river, Aaliyah returned home. The apartment was quiet, except for the low hum of the street below. On the wall hung Jamal's photo, his smile still wide, still alive in the frame. She stood before it for a long moment. "We did it," she whispered. "You lit the fire. I just kept it burning." Before turning in, she checked her phone. A new story had gone viral. A teenage girl from Chicago had used footage from a traffic stop to expose 2 officers falsifying evidence. 8 arrests followed. The girl's caption read, "I learned from Aaliyah Johnson. Defend your truth." Aaliyah set the phone down, closed her eyes, and exhaled. The movement had outgrown her, just as she'd hoped. The fire no longer needed her hands to keep it alive. Justice had become its own living thing, carried forward by strangers she would never meet. In the stillness of that night, with the city breathing outside her window, Aaliyah finally allowed herself a rare and gentle smile. The fight that began in grief had ended in grace. One sister's reckoning had become a world's awakening, and as dawn approached, The light over the city felt different, brighter, steadier, unyielding. Thank you for watching and spending your time with this story. If it moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Together we can keep the voice of justice alive.